Every day, your ancestors went outside. They hunted. They walked for hours. They gathered food. They followed animals across open landscapes, searched for plants, carried water, and moved from one place to another. They had no buildings, no cars, no sunscreen, and for much of human history, very little between their skin and the sun. And that sunlight mattered. Over thousands of generations, the amount of ultraviolet radiation reaching your ancestors' skin helped shape one of the most visible differences between human populations today: skin pigmentation. But before we go any further, there's something you may not have thought about. Where did those ancestors actually come from? If you had to guess where the first humans appeared, what continent would you choose? Europe? Asia? Maybe somewhere else? The scientific evidence points to Africa, and this isn't based on one discovery. In 2017, paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin and his team studied human fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. Using several dating methods, they estimated the remains to be around 300,000 years old. They were among the oldest known remains of our species ever discovered. But the discovery was even more important than the age. The fossils were found alongside stone tools, showing that these people were not simply isolated individuals. They belonged to a population living in North Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. And they weren't the only ancient humans found on the continent. Older populations had already been discovered in eastern and southern Africa, so the picture began to change. Instead of imagining one tiny group living in one particular place, scientists began seeing evidence of populations spread across a huge continent, and that matters because Africa is enormous. Different regions had different climates, different landscapes, different animals, and different amounts of sunlight. Our ancestors were not living in one identical environment. They were adapting to many environments within Africa itself, and genetics tells a similar story. When scientists compare DNA from populations around the world, African populations contain an extraordinary amount of genetic diversity. That pattern is consistent with an African origin for our species. But this wasn't one small group sitting in one place. Human populations moved. They separated. They mixed, they disappeared, and eventually, some of our ancestors began moving beyond Africa. And that's where our story becomes much more complicated. Because imagine leaving the environment your ancestors had lived in for hundreds of thousands of years and moving farther north. The sunlight becomes weaker, the seasons become colder, the winters become longer, and suddenly, your ancestors have a completely different problem. How do you survive the cold? Think about what humans had available. No modern jackets, no heated buildings, no central heating, no supermarkets supplying food through the winter. So did humans already know how to make clothing before entering these freezing environments? Or did they reach cold regions first and then invent ways to protect themselves? Archaeologists have found clues. At Contrabandier's Cave in Morocco, researchers found bone tools and animal remains dating back roughly 120,000 to 90,000 years. Some of the bones show patterns consistent with processing animal hides. The discovery doesn't give us an actual ancient jacket. The clothing itself is gone. But it suggests that humans were already processing animal skins in ways that could have been connected to clothing production. And there's another strange piece of evidence. Lice. Yes, lice. Body lice live in clothing rather than directly on the scalp. So scientists can study their DNA and use their evolutionary history as an indirect clue for when humans began regularly wearing clothes. Research involving genetic differences between head lice and body lice suggested that clothing may have appeared tens of thousands of years before the last ice age. That doesn't mean scientists found a shirt that old. They didn't. It's indirect evidence, but it raises an extraordinary possibility. Humans may have developed regular clothing while still living in Africa, before the great expansion into some of the coldest regions of the planet. In other words, maybe humans didn't arrive in the cold completely unprepared. Maybe they carried technology with them. And clothing wasn't necessarily the only answer. Fire mattered, shelter mattered, food mattered, cooperation mattered. Humans didn't need their bodies to become perfectly adapted to every climate. They could change the environment around themselves. They could build shelters, control fire, prepare food, make tools, and use clothing to create a small artificial climate around the body. This is one of the most important differences between asking, could the human body survive the cold, and asking, could humans survive the cold? The answer to the first question is limited. The answer to the second is dramatically different, because humans don't survive only with biology. We survive with biology plus behavior. But while humans were learning how to survive colder environments, something else was changing too: the sunlight. And this takes us back to skin. Because ultraviolet radiation is one of the major environmental forces that shaped human pigmentation. Anthropologist Nina Jablonski and her colleagues have studied this relationship for decades. Their research shows a strong relationship between ultraviolet radiation and global patterns of human skin pigmentation. In environments with intense ultraviolet radiation, dark pigmentation provides important protection against UV damage. One important part of the explanation involves folate. High levels of ultraviolet radiation can damage folate, a vitamin that plays important roles in reproduction and development. Melanin absorbs ultraviolet radiation and helps protect the tissues beneath the skin, so under the intense sunlight found in many tropical environments, darker pigmentation offered an important biological advantage. But now imagine the opposite environment, much farther from the equator. Less intense ultraviolet radiation, long winters, and less UVB reaching the skin. Now another biological problem appears. Your body needs UVB radiation to produce vitamin D. Too much ultraviolet radiation can be harmful, but too little can also create problems. And this changed the evolutionary pressure on human pigmentation. Over many generations, populations living in lower UV environments could experience selection favoring lighter pigmentation because less melanin allows more UVB to reach the skin. But here's where the story gets surprising. It wasn't immediate, and it didn't happen everywhere in the same way. If humans simply became lighter as soon as they left Africa, we wouldn't expect to find what archaeologists and geneticists have actually found. Consider one of the most famous ancient Europeans, Cheddar Man. He lived in Britain around 10,000 years ago. His skeleton was discovered in Gough's Cave in Somerset. More than a century later, scientists were able to recover DNA from his remains, and the genetic evidence suggested that Cheddar Man had dark pigmentation and blue eyes. Think about that. A man living in Britain around 10,000 years ago, with ancestors who had been living outside Africa for thousands of years, could still have dark skin. So the idea that humans left Africa and immediately became light-skinned doesn't work. The transformation was much more complicated. Different populations were exposed to different environments. Different diets changed the amount of vitamin D they could obtain from food. Different genes influenced pigmentation, and populations repeatedly moved, mixed, and separated. There wasn't one moment when humans suddenly changed from dark to light. It was a process that happened differently in different places and at different times. And that's why ancient DNA is so important. Bones can tell us where people lived. Tools can tell us what they did. But DNA can sometimes reveal what happened to their populations long after those people disappeared. It can show migrations. It can show population mixing. It can even reveal encounters between different ancient human groups. And all of those pieces come together to tell us something remarkable. Human skin color isn't simply a racial category. It is part of an evolutionary history, a history written by sunlight, by migration, by climate, by diet, by culture, and by thousands of generations of natural selection. Our ancestors began their journey in Africa. They spread into environments with radically different amounts of sunlight. They learned to survive cold through technology and cooperation. And slowly, across generations, their bodies adapted to the worlds they entered. So when you look at human skin today, you're not just looking at a color, you're looking at a record of where our ancestors lived, what environments they faced, and how their bodies changed as they followed humanity's longest journey across the planet.